I'm often asked, which is my favorite trip? And of course, it's been an impossible question to answer, like somebody trying to choose their favorite child. Special comes in many flavors, but when hard-pressed and I had to just pick one, I would choose my epic New Zealand tour out of the almost 50 countries I've visited so far. Sorry, New Zealand, you have been bumped off the top pedestal, and there is now a clear-cut winner I won't hesitate now to answer. If asked my favorite place I've ever been to, the answer, Antarctica. And to think I almost didn't go because I was worried about being cold, but seeing penguins trumped being cold. And it turns out not only was I comfortable, I now truly understand what my mom always told me, there's no such thing as bad weather, only poor clothing choices. I was fine. Indeed, more than fine. It was exhilarating. My Antarctica expedition was a mind-blowing combination of sights and sensations, of tens of thousands of penguins calling to each other, of fur seals frolicking in the sea, while alpha males guard their harem, where whales spout and breach the South Atlantic waves, and the icebergs. Wait until I tell you about the icebergs and the glaciers of Antarctica, including kayaking around them, or hiking in the footsteps of Sir Ernest Shackleton and his most heroic and unimaginable rescue, plus other regional history. Not to mention our amazing ship, the MS Fram, and the new friends and crew of my outstanding adventure. Even if Antarctica had not been on your radar before, listen to today's show and you are going to start an Antarctica savings bucket. Trust me on this one. I can't wait to share all my Antarctica stories with you, so let's get started. Welcome to the Active Travel Adventures podcast. I'm your host, Kit Parks. Today we're heading to Antarctica on my Hurtigruten in-depth Antarctica tour, which also included the Falkland and South Georgia islands. Mind you, I only chose to go on this in-depth tour rather than straight to and from Antarctica because I wanted to avoid going through the Drake Passage twice, which is what you do if you just sail down to Antarctica and then turn around and come back. On my tour, we went in a circle, finishing up going through the Drake, so I only had to go through it once. Little did I know that those two stops, especially South Georgia Island, would be a highlight. In fact, on day 8 of the 23-day expedition, while on South Georgia Island, I told my new friends I considered I'd already got my money's worth. But wait a second, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's roll back to the beginning. I don't consider myself a cruise person. Never ever stepped foot on one of the big cruise lines. I did the ferry system in Alaska. I did the small boat and bike tour in Croatia. And off the top of my head, I think that's all I've done of sleeping on a boat. The idea of being confined to a ship, no matter how large, didn't sound like fun to me. But I've often dreamt of Antarctica, and the only way I knew to get there was by ship. Antarctica entered my radar after watching that fantastic film, March of the Penguins, where you see hundreds of thousands of giant emperor penguins. But I didn't just want to see it through a documentary. I want to experience Antarctica's wildlife and its ice, not simply observing it like I was looking inside a fishbowl. In short, I wanted to adventure travel Antarctica. So this means I need to go on an expedition cruise where you can actually participate with the environment. On expedition cruises, you have the opportunity, always weather permitting, with the wind and the swells being the enemy, not cold or rain, by the way. So on expedition cruises, you have the opportunity to hike, to kayak, snowshoe, and even camp on the ice. You can often participate in citizen science projects and work on your photography skills with a professional photographer. We had tons of activities to do. And I had learned from my interview with Margaret in episode 63 that if you sail to the Falkland Islands and South Georgia Islands on your way to Antarctica, then you only have to go through the spicy Drake Passage once, a couple of days at the end of the trip. The Drake Passage can be rough because that's where the Atlantic crashes into the Pacific. Maybe you'll get lucky, but it's possible you'll feel seasick, so the idea of going through this section at the very end of my trip was a definite selling feature for me. I figured the two islands would offer some fascinating history, but I soon found out that they are a definite treat all on their own, which I'll soon tell you about. So to hopefully avoid seasickness altogether, I brought some Dramamine tablets, and I also bought a relief band, which is a pulse zapper that's supposed to help with nausea. I'll put a link in the show notes. Armed with these, and fingers crossed, I decided to commit to going while I was all the way down on the southern tip of South America. I booked my expedition with Hurtigruten, the first and world leader in expedition cruises. Hurtigruten is based in Norway, so these folks are experts in navigating polar seas. So to me, this seemed like a very smart choice for this remote, icy destination. Hurtigruten's been around since the 1800s, and the ship I'd be going on, the MS Fram, had recently been completely remodeled, which sounded nice. Hurtigruten also had a departure just a few days after I finished my Patagonia adventure with Active Adventures, so the timing was perfect. I figured I may never make it this far south again, so this was my golden opportunity to make it to Antarctica. The Hurtigruten tour actually starts in Santiago, Chile, and then flies a charter plane down to Punta Arenas, but since I was already down there, I made arrangements to join the group right at the ship. The port is in downtown Punta Arenas, so it was a quick cab ride from my hotel to check in. After going through security, we all boarded a bus which drove us down to the ship, which was only 500 meters away. I thought this was amusing, but the law said that we couldn't walk there. Once on board, I was assigned my cabin, given a key fob, and this was also my access and basically ID card for all things while on the ship. I was delighted with my room. I was expecting a cramped cubbyhole with no room, but I got, and I should mention that I had upgraded to a mid-level cabin with a porthole. I'd gotten a lovely queen-size comfy bed with upscale linens, a small coffee and tea area, and a sitting area, a surprisingly spacious closet, and a full modern bath with a great shower. Nice. We had a mandatory safety meeting just before departure, where we learned and then did a drill of what to do should we have an emergency evacuation. The neon orange zoot suits look ridiculous, but hopefully they buy you a little bit of time if you had to go in the water or were stuck in a lifeboat. The ship had plenty of boats and different kinds of boats in case of an emergency. Once we did our drill and knew where our assigned muster station was, we set off in blessedly calm waters. In fact, I only realized that we'd set sail because the scenery was changing outside my window. Throughout our voyage, I was impressed with the safety consciousness of the crew. They always went out of their way to show us all the cool things, but they would go scout first to make sure everything was safe for us and for all the critters. Once I got settled in, I headed down to the main lounge area where they offered us a welcome drink and a light snack if you're hungry. In addition to the lounge, they have some really nice upholstered chairs with ottomans that face the sea, so you can just relax, watch the water, and look for wildlife. We would be motoring through the Magellan Strait, crossing through the Narrows, a skinny spit of land, at around 10 p.m. that night. First was dinner in the Yun dining room. You get full board, which means that all my meals were included, plus house wine and beer during lunch and dinner in this restaurant. They also have a fine dining restaurant called the Nordstrom that you can book separately, or if you book a suite, it's included with your package. If you like the fancy drinks, Hurtigruten also offers a package deal that might be of interest and can save you some money. Regular house beer and wine was fine with me, though. Using the Hurtigruten app, you choose your meal times, although as time went by, I noticed we usually just went down when we were hungry. On the first night I headed down for dinner, I was seated at a table with 3 other solo passengers, which was fun. Sue, Tim, Charlotte, and I had a wonderful buffet dinner and got to exchange stories and get to know each other a bit. One thing I noticed after just a few days was how sharp our dining hostess Giovanna was in seating us. She seemed to pay close attention to who got along well with whom, which table needed a chatter person to liven things up, and who hadn't met whom yet. You could, of course, sit with whomever you wanted, but especially for me traveling solo, I loved being matched up with different dining partners for each meal. So Giovanna would assign us to a table, and then Andre, who always lit up like he was delighted you'd shown up, would escort us to our tables. The wait staff was also quite observant, and most learned our names and drink preferences in short order. A special shout out to St. Anthony, John, Roger, Chriswen, and Delphin, who mostly took care of me. In fact, all the crew members, from housekeeping to loaders to expedition crew, were top-notch, and there wasn't a crew member I interacted with that I wouldn't hire myself. This indicated to me that Hurtigruten gets the pick of the litter when it comes to staffing, so they must be doing something right to hire such an exemplary team. Behind the scenes in the kitchen, they must have some great chefs as well. I was delighted that the food tasted good and that there was a large selection, so you're sure to find something that appealed to you. I also love the salad bar, especially since I hadn't eaten many salads in the last couple of months and really missed them. I was so delighted with the Hurtigruten operation that when I returned home, I wrote their marketing department and asked if they'd like to be an affiliate of this program, and they readily agreed. So I'm delighted to welcome them on board the Active Travel Adventures podcast ecosystem, and I would encourage you to use my links to reach out to their website. You'll be helping to support the program at no additional cost to you, which would be much appreciated. So thank you for that. At 9 p.m., we all met up again in the lounge to meet the captain and our expedition leaders. Not only do they have an array of trained folks to keep us safe on our expeditions, but we also have scientists, historians, and even an ornithologist. That's the bird scientist that can teach us anything we want to know about what we'd be seeing. I shared a table with David, a Scot who'd brought his bagpipes, something he said he did on all trips. He was working with Jane, one of the historians, to see about playing the pipes at Shackelford's grave, something Jane and the crew thought was a great idea, provided the fur seals hadn't taken over the area, which we heard was a distinct possibility. As it turns out, the crew ended up worrying that the bagpipes would disturb the wildlife, so the idea was scrapped. They feared that some male seals would come to investigate the odd noise, creating an opportunity for other males to emerge from the sea to take their unguarded harems, so we didn't want to do anything that would alter their behavior. After meeting the crew, David and I, who quickly became fast friends, chatted a bit more before it was time to call it a night. I already loved my cabin, but then I discovered it had fabulous blackout curtains, which made me love it even more, especially since it stays light until quite late this far south during the southern hemisphere spring. So it stays pretty light until about 10 o'clock, and then the sun comes up somewhere around 2 a.m. this far south at this time of the year. As I crashed in my comfy bed, I realized that when they renovated the ship last summer, they hadn't skimped on comfort. I had a feeling I was going to love this adventure. The next day we would be at sea all day long, en route to the Falkland Islands, our first stop. Hurtigruten had plenty of activities to keep us occupied. I actually had more difficulty finding time to slip in a quick workout in the gym. If your preference is to chill, read, or just look out at wildlife, you can certainly find a comfortable place to sit and relax. To do that, as you watch the sea and wildlife and often dramatic landscapes pass by, either inside, on the lounge areas, or on the observation deck. But Hurtigruten offers classes and workshops and science projects and other activities to keep you as busy as you care to be. In fact, I was advised about this on an upcoming podcast interview about Hurtigruten's Greenland expedition with Jim. I was chatting with Jim after the interview about cycling the Hansa region of the Netherlands and asked him about what other fun adventures he'd done. My ears perked up when he mentioned he went with Hurtigruten, as I'd just booked my Antarctica expedition with them. He said he absolutely loved his Greenland trip, so I asked to interview him about it. He had told me that on his trip there was something going on at all times, so at the end of the day, all you did was crash into bed. So I figured it'd be similar to my own expedition. The first full day of our cruise involves getting organized and learning how the ship and everything works. It's obvious that safety is the number one priority of Hurtigruten. Certainly they want us to have a trip of a lifetime, but they want us and the animals to be safe. At sea, we would be going to the sea and the shore in zodiacs or tenderboats, so we had to learn how to get in and out of them in a tenderfoot briefing by lead expedition leader Tomsky. Hurtigruten also lent us some rubber muck boots to wear on landings. They're not just waterproof, but they're easy to clean in between trips. Biosecurity, the prevention of bringing invasive pests or diseases to this pristine and important ecological environment, was paramount. We learned how to properly clean our boots and outerwear, down to using picks to remove every last grain of sand or speck of feather. None of us wanted to be responsible for bringing bird flu to this beautiful area. By the end of our second day, we had learned our way around the ship and how things operated. And soon it would be time to reach the Falkland Islands. Since we'd be on the ship for 3 weeks, this podcast would take forever to capture each day. So what I'll do instead is to chunk it by topic so you can get a good idea of what it's like and what you'd expect. As mentioned, we're going to 3 main destinations: the Falkland Islands, which I'd never heard about till the Argentinian War with England in 1982, the South Georgia Islands, which I'd never heard about until my interview with Margaret about her Antarctica trip, and of course Antarctica, which had intrigued me since the March of the Penguins. Let's start first with why go to Antarctica. The main reasons people go to Antarctica is to see the wildlife. And depending on when you go, and I'll get to a little bit more of this later, what you see when depends on which month you're going to choose to go in. But you're going to see fur seals, whales, penguins, birds from the sea, shorebirds, and land birds. And when I say sea, I'm talking like thousands and thousands of critters. I'd never seen anything like it, and I've been on safari in Africa. You also go there to see the landscape, the ice, the glaciers, the icebergs, just the rugged beauty of some of the mountains. Yes, there are mountains. And sometimes just to touch foot on the 7th continent of the world. On our second day at sea, we arrive at the Falklands. I remember seeing the rolling hills dotted with some kind of a yellow flowered brush. We zodiaced ashore and take a hike over the hills, and to our delight, come to the other side where we find a high rocky cliff being smashed by the waves. I could have looked at that cliff being bashed all day, but instead got distracted by the thousands of birds. We were at a rookery, or breeding site for mollymox, also called black-browed albatross and the darling rockhopper penguins. These rockhopper penguins are adorable tiny penguins that live up to their name, hopping as they find straw to feather their nests, or an exceptionally special pebble to bring home as a present to their mate, or to hop up and down the cliff to and from the sea. These cute penguins, like the macaroni penguins we'll see a little bit later, have an exceptional bright yellow plumage, like fancy yellow eyebrows over their red eyes, their orange beak, and their black head. Be sure to check out my website and the video with my penguin highlights so you can see them up close. The albatross to me look like enormous seagulls, and by enormous, I mean wingspans almost 8 feet long. And they, like the rockhoppers, were everywhere. It was incredible. I couldn't believe I was standing here about 10,000 kilometers or 6,200 miles as a mollymock flies from home. Unbelievable. We also saw some of the scavenger birds, skuas, who, when lucky, would snatch a penguin egg for lunch. As much as that's annoying, it's the scavengers who keep the beaches clean. There were other birds as well, but these are the ones I most remember from that day. The Zodiacs are these rubber rafts with a motor on it that the expedition crew leader and the driver would zoom us about, get us to shore, or take us around up and down the coast to look at the wildlife from sea. Going out in the landings and going on these little expeditions, that was one of the key things that we loved about this trip. On one landing, we had a longer hike to the beach with a bunch of Magellanic penguins. These birds like to make burrows in the tussock grass that once covered all of the Falklands, although much of the land has now been pastured for sheep and cattle. It was so much fun watching groups of these penguins race onto the beach to and from the sea. I think they like to do it super fast because it's fun, as the water next to the shore here was kind of too shallow to worry about a leopard seal eating them. Leopard seals are their nemesis. Some would just zoom in and out, like I said, seemingly just because it was fun. Next up in the Falklands was Port Stanley. Only around 2,000 people live on this British territory that Argentina still claims as the Malvinas, even though the Brits have run this for closing in on 200 years. Remember back in 1982, Argentina attacked the Falklands to try to get it back. I visited the Stanley Museum and got the perspective of the locals about the brief war. There are memorials in the town as well for the fallen. While in town, too, you can pick up a copy of the local paper, the Penguin News. I took a guided hike around the peninsula with a local who told us about the flora and fauna in the area. Because of the harsh winds and brutal weather, little grows more than knee-high. Trees that were imported to plant as a windbreak by the buildings have canopies bent over and sculpted by the wind. To give you an example, on my walk, we had close to 60-knot winds. David, the bagpiper I mentioned earlier, brought his pipes to shore and played for us in the most popular local bar, which was kind of fun. I was planning to buy lunch there, but they only took British pounds or Chilean dollars, neither of which I had, and I didn't want to go to an ATM just to get 20 pounds, so I decided to eat on the ship instead. David and I had just missed the shuttle bus, so decided to walk the few miles rather than wait an hour for the next one. But we were quickly picked up by a local. I'm sure David's kilt helped. The guy not only took us to the ship, but offered to show us around. He, like several locals I met, loved living in the Falklands. They thought it was a great, wholesome place to raise a family. After lunch, I shuttled back to explore the town further and to take a guided walking tour that was part of our Hurtigruten booking. One of the most striking images in town is the Whalebone Arch, situated in front of Christ Church Cathedral. It was constructed in 1933 from the jawbones of 2 blue whales and commemorates a century of continuous British administration in the Falklands. After a long, fun day, I turned in to find a plate of assorted chocolates on my bed as a nighttime treat, left by Angel, my housekeeper. Literally, how sweet. We spent 3 days poking around the Falklands, going on several Zodiac landings, in addition to the Stanley port. On our last day, I got a nice treat. I was called to reception and was told that I had been upgraded to a suite. Now that was really sweet. And thank you very much, Hurtigruten. This, my friend, is a really nice benefit of doing this podcast. My original room was lovely and very comfortable. However, my suite had to be twice as large, and it had a desk and a sitting area with a couch and a chair, plus a much larger window, which I loved. In fact, one day I was looking out the window while I was getting dressed, and a whale was right outside my window. And if I had good aim, this humpback whale was close enough, I could have tossed a penny into his blowhole. Not that I would, I'm just saying it was close enough that I could have. It was unbelievable and a great way to start the day. The Fram has some even fancier suites that have private decks. I think some even have a hot tub. I'll put photos on the website. All the rooms are lovely. You just choose the room according to your budget and your desires. Before long, our time in the Falklands was over and we sailed on to head towards South Georgia Island. We'd be at sea for 2 days and wondered how I was going to fill my time. This was not going to be an issue. Every morning, I'd look at the schedule that was slipped under our door each night and had to figure out what to do. And I noticed after several days, the schedule of the lectures we got was not random. Like sometime during the expedition, let's teach them about this, or let's show them about that, or tell them about this. No, we'd get the lecture right before it would be cool for us to have the knowledge. For example, we learned about seals right before we landed on South Georgia Island, when there were 5 million seals. We learned how the islands and the rocks were formed right before we went on a Zodiac tour where we could see the smashing tectonic plates and the various layers formed over time. It was like Hurtigruten unfolded and peeled back Antarctica and the islands like a treasure to be discovered, or maybe like peeling back the layers of an onion to reveal its core. They choreographed the lectures beautifully to give us just-in-time knowledge so we'd fully appreciate what we were seeing. A little later, I'll be describing all the different kinds of activities we could do, but for now, I want to focus on what we saw, with the exception of the art classes. That I want to tell you about now. One of the activities I saw was watercolor class. I didn't think I had any artistic talent, but I decided, that sounds kind of fun. So I went to Jay-Z's watercolor workshop. I have to tell you, not only was I kind of proud of what I painted, as were all of us, that I discovered painting is one of the most relaxing things I think I've ever done. You can mess up quickly in watercolor, so you have to really, really concentrate, and all the other nonsense gets pushed out of your monkey brain. It is excellent therapy, and whenever I finally get a house again, I shall have a painting area. Painting sessions were also a great way to get to know some of the other guests better. And let's talk a little bit about who the people were on this ship. First of all, I had this impression of cruise ships as being a bunch of, let's say, buffet-excited, non-mobile, older people. That's not what expedition ships are. Expedition ships, or at least our ship, we had all ages, much younger than I thought. I would say the average was probably 50s and 60s, although we had people like Noemi in her early 20s who had saved up to do this. We had quite a few people in their 30s. There were no little kids, and there was just one family that brought some grown children, late teens and early 20s. And the family kind of kept to themselves more, whereas the other guests tend to mingle more, I would say, just so you have a reference point. We had mostly active people, active travelers, an extremely well-traveled group. People did the most amazing things all over the world. And it was great because people were so well-traveled. I don't know about you, but when I get home, most of my friends and family back home, they're not big travelers. And so they're not really interested in our stories. So to be able to have conversations and exchange travel stories with people that didn't think you were bragging if you said, oh, I did this, or I wanted to do this, or tell me about this. It was just so nice to A, learn about some really cool places and experiences, and B, just to be able to share my own stories too without feeling like I was bragging. So I loved that for sure. And I think we had a total of 17 countries represented. Most everybody could speak English, so communication was never a problem. There was also a lot of Germans, a lot of Dutch, lots and lots of Brits and Aussies, and a hodgepodge, like I said, from a whole array of countries and experiences. Truly a really nice group of people. And I loved, again, as I said, how Giovanna would kind of introduce us around by seating us together at meals. So we really got to know people. And it was really a great, great experience. And I walked away with, I'd say, 10 people I still keep up with. And I'm recording this 2 months after. I think that's exceptional. So the people were cool. Another great benefit for going on an Antarctic expedition. So getting back to the ship, not only were we kept happily busy during our at-sea days, we also got to see a lot of whales, mostly humpback whales this time of year. And I went there at the end of November into the middle of December. In fact, once during lunch, a large pod of around 60 whales were in front of the ship. They weren't very close, but you could see their blows, as in, there she blows, way up front of the ship. And did you know you can tell what kind of whale it is by their blow, whatever whatever you call the water that comes out of their blowhole? The shape of that tells you if it's a humpback whale, if it's an orca whale, and all these kinds of things. I thought that was very interesting. And you can drill down even further if you're lucky enough to see the whale's tail or its fluke. Because of the scars and different variation, it's like a fingerprint. You can actually identify which specific whale you saw. And there's an online database. So let's say you get a photo, you're lucky enough to capture a photo of a whale tail or fluke. You can go online and see where your whale is in the world as they migrate up and down the hemispheres. I was tickled to death with all the whales we saw, and we weren't even there during whale season. The very best month to see whales is in February. So if we saw as many as we did during the non-peak season, I can't even imagine how many whales you must see in February a couple months later. Now let's talk about the Antarctica seasons. I put a chart that Hurtigruten made on the website, but in a nutshell, the expedition season to Antarctica runs late October through March, which is spring through early fall in the southern hemisphere. So, October and November is when you'll find pristine ice conditions because the relative warmth won't have melted any or even much, but it's still going to be colder. You're going to get the best prices during these 2 months as well as March. Penguins are going to be there all 6 months, and we saw hundreds of thousands of penguins. But peak penguin time runs from mid-January to mid-March when you get to see the penguins and their chicks running around. In fact, I'm going to have to go back just to see that. On the various different places that we landed, we saw breeding pairs, some were incubating eggs, and a few newborn chicks screaming for food. And my friend Kay got a great photo that I put on the website of some of these chicks. The fur seals are there into January. That's their breeding time before they head back out to sea. You get to see the pups from mid-December into January. I loved seeing them, but they are so many. There's I believe like 95% of all the fur seals are in South Georgia Island. But sometimes there's so many fur seals that the beaches are closed off for us because there's just too many of them. You can't land. I think they're also pushing out some of the penguins, and some are even thinking that the decline of some of the cute Gentoo penguins we saw is because of the abundance of seals these days. Hard to believe they were almost hunted to extinction not that long ago. Whale watching season starts in December and really picks up steam, February being the peak month, and tapers off at the beginning of March. While I didn't see them, in addition to the many humpback whales that I did see, some people saw minke whales and one orca, and that's the killer whale. And it's funny, whenever the whales were about, everyone would go racing to see. On the main activity floor, which is level 4, that's a whole wall of windows. So you could go there, or you could go up to deck 7 and go outside on the observation deck to get an unobstructed view. Even in the Explorer Lounge, that had huge windows facing forward, so you didn't have to get outside and get your gear on if you didn't feel like it. In fact, a couple of times also, Jane was presenting, and everything would come to a halt because there's whales outside. It never got old. The warmest months are from December through February, and I must say, we had great weather. In fact, our expedition leader Tomsky teased us to keep using all of our weather voodoo. It would get down to freezing, but I can only think of a couple times that I was uncomfortable outside, and that's because I had raced outside without putting enough layers on. Once, the intercom announced that some dolphins were bow riding. Dolphins are really playful creatures, and they love to ride the wakes of ships. Sometimes they just like to show off and zoom and dive alongside the ship. They might do this for a couple minutes, or 10 or 15 minutes, and I didn't want to miss it, so I went out without my gloves or a proper jacket. And speaking of jackets, Hurtigruten gives all guests a very nice red waterproof parka. So in many photos, you're going to see all of us looking like bundled little red Santas. On the sleeves, there's a pocket that holds our ID card. So whenever we enter or leave the ship, our card gets scanned so they know whether or not we've returned. We got used to the sound of goodbye when we left and then welcome when we returned. Let's get back to South Georgia. I'm delighted that I really didn't know how many animals I would see when I got there. I was gobsmacked. Now that is a great word that needs to be used more. So I was utterly gobsmacked. I thought we saw a lot of penguins in the Falklands. That was nothing compared to South Georgia Island. In fact, South Georgia is called the Serengheti of the Southern Oceans. The beaches were absolutely filled with king penguins and fur seals. You've got to see my pictures and short videos at activetraveladventures.com. I did highlight wheels of the penguins and one of the fur seals and one of the icebergs, as well as a more in-depth video of my entire trip. You've got to check them out. Spent a lot of time on them, and I hope that you enjoy them. Now, mind you, at virtually every landing, we would see penguins. And this never got boring because they seemed to take us to see different varieties of penguins, and they seemed to know where all the colonies are. And Captain and Tomsky, the expedition leader, would work together to come up with a plan depending on the weather. And you might think, well, I saw a lot of rock hoppers in the Falklands, but that's a completely different experience than seeing the gentoos on their rock nests with the little chicks below, or the adelies waiting for the snow to melt so they could build their nests and breed. Each of the penguin colonies had different personalities, different habitats, different kinds of nests. It was all very, very exciting. I was particularly enchanted by the macaroni penguins. Like the rockhoppers, they boast a huge yellow plumage. They got their name from the macaroni. Remember the Yankee Doodle song?
Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap, he called it macaroni.
So the macaronis look like dandies. We got to see them jumping down a cliff in and out of the water. And this was the beach that had this really cool landscape where we could actually see all the layers of the passage of time. They were all crammed together from the tectonic plates, squished up vertically. It was really cool. There was even a pretty waterfall. And to our delight, barreling out of the water comes an enormous elephant seal. These guys can weigh up to 4,500 pounds. I have a great video shot of him in my seal video on the website. These guys have such an ugly face, it's one only a mother could love. Fur seals come to South Georgia to breed in the early spring, which is November for us. At times, they so overran the beach that we watched them from the safety of the Zodiacs, which I rather liked because then we could get closer to them. Particularly, there's just so many of them. There's like almost no space on the beach. In fact, on one beach, the guides had cleared a path for us to land and get on shore so that we could watch them, but other males in the water quickly came in to take over the vacancy. So rather than disrupt the pecking order of the beach, we watched them from the Zodiacs. Some of my favorite videos I took from the excursions of all this seal activity along with the waves of the king penguins coming in and out of the ocean. It was absolutely incredible. On one of our earlier landings, a guide had to push the first seals away with a long pole. They're not really aggressive towards us, and they don't mind us being around for the most part, the alpha males notwithstanding. So you didn't have to be afraid of them, but you didn't want to accidentally step on one. And we were literally warned to always look behind us before we took a photo or walking backwards, because they were everywhere. Most were sleeping, digesting whatever they'd eaten out at sea. But then you may not have heard one slide right next to you. And I can't figure out how to describe what they do. They've got fins in the front, so they'll put the fins in the ground, and then they'll take their bulk, I think like 400 pounds, on their hind. They've got little fins, but it's like attached to their butt bone. So they kind of like a humpy jump, skip with their butt and pull forward with their fins. It's rather comical and does not look very comfortable. They're very clunky on land, but once they get to sea, they glide and are miracles in the water. And I've got some video that you'll see some of that in the video I shot. And sleeping, they look like they're just smiling in their dreams. But my new friend Tim captured an amazing shot of a seal's head coming out of the water with all of its teeth bared. He didn't look so friendly. So you got to check that one out as well. Pretty much, unless you're challenging one of the alpha males, one of the bulls, or get too close to his cubs, they pretty much ignore you. But a bite would not be fun, and it could get infected. So still, as much as possible, we had to try to stay at least 6 feet away. But a lot of times, it simply was not possible. Also in South Georgia, the king penguins by the score. But instead of synchronized swimming, these guys would synchronize, like dive into the water in a wave. It was like doing the wave in a stadium. All the while, the fur seals were diving all around or chasing each other on the beach. And some cubs had recently been born, and we weren't even there during main cub season. They were just starting to be born. And so you would cringe as the big alpha male would be bellowing and wandering about, and you're hoping he's not going to squish his new kid. It was just a cacophony of penguin and seal calls, and I can't try to mimic them. You're just going to have to listen to the video. Oh, take that back. I recorded some. Let me get that. Hold on just 1 second. Is that not cool? I totally had my mind blown in South Georgia. As far as I was concerned, I got my money's worth there. Antarctica was going to be a bonus. I can certainly understand why South Georgia Island is compared to Africa's Serengheti, and luckily I've now been to both. But where in the Serengheti the animals fill in the savanna, here on South Georgia, they're more concentrated on the beaches. Both are incredible sights I encourage you to add to your bucket list. But here in South Georgia, it's not just the beaches, but even the seas are teemed with wildlife. And during lunch, my friend Kay mentioned that she had just gotten off the phone with her husband, all the while watching seals and penguins playing outside her window in the sea. Now, that's not something you can say every day. I thought it was cool that even though Kay's husband didn't want to come, she wanted to come see all this stuff herself, so she found a girlfriend who wanted to come. But even if not, there were plenty of solo people on the ship, so you're never going to feel like, oh gosh, I'm all by myself. I was never alone unless I felt like being alone. But getting back to the wildlife, it was not unusual at all to see something right outside your window. I saw that super close humpback just outside my window in South Georgia, and once while having lunch, there's 3 whales right outside our window while we're sitting there having our lunch. It's unbelievable. One historic stop was in the former whaling station in Hurtigruten. We started our stop with a toast by the captain. We were toasting Sir Ernest Shackleton. Shackleton, if you're not familiar with him, was an explorer back in the heyday of great polar exploration, and he wanted to be the first person to cross the South Pole by land. And so he took his ship, the Endurance, and his crew down to Antarctica. And before they got to where they'd get off the ice, the ship was trapped in the sea ice, which eventually froze. The ice, as it expanded, crushed the ship, leaving the men in the middle of this frigid polar region with no ship. Now, they did have a couple of 3 lifeboats, I believe it was. And So they set off dragging these lifeboats across until they finally got to sea. They landed eventually on Elephant Island, which I get to see later. You'll hear about that. And then Shackelford and I believe it was 4 or 5 crew members took off across the Drake's Passage in this teeny little 22-foot boat, eventually making it to South Georgia Island. So that is the base story of Shackleton. You'll learn a little bit more as we go on. So that's who we're toasting here at the gravesite of where Ernest Shackleton was buried. Well, after he was rescued, Shackleton ends up dying of a heart attack. So his crew was shipping his body to Europe to be with his wife. But when she found out, she insisted they'd turn it around and head back to South Georgia, the place where Shackleton loved best. Here's some of the captain's toast. Please excuse the wind in the background.
Knowing that his heart truly belonged to the frozen Southern Ocean, his widow asked he be buried here rather than returned to England.
And with that, we raised our glass to his grave and took a shot of whiskey. And before I go on a little bit more about what we did in Grytviken, I want to tell you part 2 of the incredible story. So in 2022, about a year after I'm recording this right now, an expedition ship set out to try to locate the original Endurance ship that was buried under the sea. Now, they knew the coordinates of where it sank from Shackleton's excellent records, but then many experts and scientists on board were trying to figure out, okay, in this last 100 years, where would this have drifted? They had an underwater drone to assist in the search when other equipment indicated there was something worth checking out. But like Shackleton, they were battling the sea ice as winter was closing in on them, and it was time they either had to find it or else turn around and head back to safety. Once they were stuck in the ice and they had to use the crane on the ship and the tank of oil to bash through the opening of the ice. I mean, pretty scary stuff. But in the last days, when they were running out of time and had to turn around, they got one last interesting ping and they set about to check it out. And wouldn't you know it, on the anniversary of the date that Shackleton was buried, where I was now standing in Grytviken, they found the Endurance. The name of the ship was so clearly visible, there's not any question or doubt. To learn more about these unbelievable stories, you can check out the book Endurance, which I already mentioned. I couldn't put the book down, even though I already knew the story. And then also there's a brand new book called The Ship Beneath the Ice. And I'll put links to both of these in the show notes and also to a YouTube video series that captures the search for the Endurance. And frankly, if you're looking for a good book to share with the kids or grandkids to read aloud, the book Endurance would be fantastic. It's a wonderful contrast to all the junk they're being fed these days. So after our toast to Shackleton, some folks explored the town and museum, but other of us had signed up for a longer hike. And when that was offered, I'm going to sign up for it. I didn't find it too hard, and we did get to reach the top of the mountain where we got stunning views of the bay on the other side. And across the bay, I saw some whitecaps, but I thought it was funny that the whitecaps are only on the other side of the bay, the far side of the bay. I asked the guide about it, and she laughed. She said, they weren't ice caps, they're icebergs. Yay, we are finally getting close to the ice. I was so excited, but like I said, from our vantage point, all it looked like to us from that vantage point from many miles away was just whitecaps. When we returned from our hike, I didn't have too much time to explore the museum before I had to get back on the ship, but I did get to see that replica of the James Caird, which is a small, like I said, it's a 22-foot boat that the Shackleton and his 5 men sailed across the sea in search of rescue. The whole thing is unimaginable to me. Even the seasoned whalers who knew the potential treachery of these waters all came to shake the hand of the man who dared sail the Drake and basically what is a small rowboat with a sail. South Georgia blew my mind. And like I said, if we returned home after Grytviken, I would have been satisfied that I've got my money's worth in this trip. And as much as I was amazed at what I'd already seen, I didn't realize that, but wait, there's more, like the old infomercials. We still had the main event to come. Now it was time to sail off to Antarctica. We're running a little long, so I think this is a good place to stop part 1. I hope you've enjoyed this. So today all we did was the Falkland Islands and South Georgia Island. We haven't even made it to Antarctica. I can't wait to tell you about that, which we'll do on the upcoming episode, which even though it'll be released on the podcast apps in 2 weeks from today, so you'll get that automatically in your feed if you subscribe. And speaking of that, I do hope you have subscribed to the podcast or follow. I think Apple calls it follow now. so that you don't miss any episodes of the Active Travel Adventures podcast. But if you don't want to wait for part 2, you can go to the website at activetraveladventures.com right now and download it directly there. Also, be sure to check out all the photos and the videos and all that. I've spent an awful lot of time. Like I said, this was the most epic, unbelievable trip of my life, and I tried to convey it as best I can on the website as well as in this podcast. I sure appreciate you listening, and I hope you've enjoyed part 1 of my Antarctic in-depth expedition with Hurtigruten, my new affiliate, which again, I encourage you to use my links to go check out their website. I will be telling you more about some of the amazing adventures and expeditions they have around the world as time goes by, but super impressed with this company and glad to have them on board. Until next time, this is Kit Parks. Adventure on!